Welcome to Paranormal Files. I'm your host, Zoe Parker, and in today's episode, we uncover a phenomenon that blurs the line between the living and the dead, whispers in the static, voices buried in white noise, sounds that shouldn't be there, yet are. These are not ghost stories. These are recordings, real, unexplained, and deeply unsettling. Tonight, we open the archive of electronic voice phenomena, unreleased tapes, hidden research, and messages that may not be meant for the living. The origins of electronic voice phenomena, often shortened to EVP, trace back to the mid-20th century, though the idea of the dead attempting to communicate with the living through sound dates back far earlier. Before tape recorders, before electricity, there were tales of whispers heard in still rooms, disembodied voices during seances, and inexplicable sounds during moments of grief or crisis. But it wasn't until 1959 that EVP was formally born. By accident. Swedish filmmaker and painter Fredrik Jürgensen had been recording birdsong in the countryside when he played back one of his tapes and heard a strange voice interjecting. It was not part of the natural environment, nor any human sound he remembered being near the microphone. The voice addressed him in Norwegian and appeared to call him by name. Jürgensen was bewildered but intrigued. He began experimenting, setting up tape recorders in quiet rooms, asking questions aloud, and leaving the tape running. When he played them back, he discovered more voices. Faint, gravelly, hard to decipher, but undeniably there. Over time, Jürgensen grew convinced he was hearing the voices of the dead. Some answered direct questions. Others seemed to offer messages of reassurance, warnings, or nonsensical phrases. He published his findings in a 1964 book titled Voices from Space, drawing both ridicule and fascination from scientists and spiritualists alike. Among those captivated was Latvian psychologist Dr. Konstantin Raudive, who took Jürgensen's work and escalated it into something more methodical and prolific. Raudive claimed to have recorded more than 100,000 EVP messages over the course of several years. He experimented with various recording conditions, different microphones, background noise, white noise, and even detuned radio frequencies. He found that certain environments seemed to foster clearer voices. These were not mere echoes or chance audio artifacts. Some messages came through in multiple languages, often switching mid-sentence. In one session, Raudive claimed to receive a message from a deceased colleague, calling him by name and referencing private conversations. His work, published in the 1971 book Breakthrough, caused a stir in both paranormal circles and the broader academic world. Some praised his rigor. Others dismissed the recordings as auditory pareidolia, the brain's tendency to find patterns in randomness. But even skeptics had to admit that some of the voices were eerie in their clarity, especially when they answered direct questions with seemingly intelligent responses. The rise of portable tape recorders in the 1970s led to a surge in amateur EVP hunters. People began conducting their own sessions in cemeteries, abandoned buildings, and their own homes. The idea that one could ask a question to thin air and receive a ghostly answer was both thrilling and terrifying. It was no longer just the domain of scientists and spiritualists. Anyone with a tape recorder and the courage to listen could join the ranks of the haunted. As the phenomenon gained traction, so did its legends. Stories circulated about cursed tapes, recordings that caused illness or hallucinations, and messages that predicted death. Some researchers reported voices becoming angry or hostile during sessions. Others warned that prolonged exposure to EVP could invite unwanted entities into one's life. Whether viewed as communication with the beyond or as something far darker, the idea of voices embedded in static had taken root, and it would only grow louder. One of the earliest and most chilling EVP encounters on record occurred in 1973 in the small village of Brunot, Italy. A local priest, Father Ernetti, who was also a trained exorcist and musicologist, began experimenting with reel-to-reel tape recorders in the monastery's chapel. His goal was to capture Gregorian chants for archival purposes. But what he recorded instead launched a decades-long debate and left more questions than answers. During a late-night session, alone in the candlelit chapel, Father Ernetti pressed record and began his usual liturgical chant. When he played the tape back the next morning, there was something else woven beneath his voice. Whispers, male, female, layered. Some crying, others laughing. And one voice in particular, calm, deep, and speaking in Latin, seemed to respond directly to his prayers. The voice uttered a phrase that would send chills down Arnetti's spine. Ego sum extra mortem. I am beyond death. He shared the tape with a fellow priest and a local bishop. Skeptical at first, they examined the equipment and attempted to reproduce the phenomenon. More voices came through, many with eerie familiarity to those who had recently died in the region. Some whispered names. Others repeated verses from scripture that hadn't been spoken during the session. The bishop forbade Arnetti from continuing his experiments, calling the voices a doorway to the unknowable. But by then, the door had already opened. That same year in Chicago, a woman named Sarah Lindgren conducted her own recording sessions after the sudden loss of her teenage son in a car accident. Unable to find closure, she set up a cassette recorder in his bedroom each night, hoping to catch a sign, any sign, that he was still with her. For weeks, there was nothing. Then, on the 27th night, at exactly 3:17 a.m., the recorder picked up a faint voice whispering, "Mom." The next night, she heard it again, followed by, "Don't cry." Sarah broke down upon hearing it and sent the tapes to a local paranormal investigator, who verified that the voice was not present during live monitoring of the room. Over the years, similar accounts began to appear across the globe. In a rural house in Kent, England, an amateur ghost hunter named Trevor Mayfield captured what he believed was the voice of his deceased grandfather, calling out from the static, "It's cold where I am." In Baltimore, a school janitor recording ambient noise for a local theater group accidentally captured a series of unintelligible whispers that, when reversed, repeated the words, "We see you." These weren't radio interferences or muffled background noise. The voices carried cadence, emotion, and in some cases, seemed fully aware they were being heard. One particularly disturbing case came from a psychiatric hospital in Prague, where researchers were studying the effects of sensory deprivation on patients. During one experiment, a subject was left in a silent, padded room while a recorder ran for 12 hours. The patient never spoke during the test. But on playback, hours of silence were interrupted by a rasping voice saying, "He's not alone in here." When investigators reviewed the footage, they confirmed that the room had been completely empty aside from the patient. No staff had entered, no intercoms were in use. The voice had no discernible source. Each of these cases fueled the growing belief that EVP was more than just stray signals or imagined sounds. The phenomenon was intelligent, specific, and in some cases, deeply personal. These weren't just random phrases captured in the ether. They were messages, seemingly targeted, sometimes comforting, and other times terrifying. As more encounters were shared, a common pattern emerged. The voices appeared most often when people were grieving, in emotional distress, or asking for answers no living person could provide. As the accounts of EVP encounters multiplied, formal investigations began to take shape across Europe and North America. Some were grassroots efforts led by amateur ghost hunters. Others were backed by universities, private laboratories, and even covert government-funded research. The driving question was no longer if these voices existed, but what they were, and whether they could be verified under controlled conditions. In the early 1980s, a small but dedicated group known as the Spiricom Project emerged in the United States. Led by George Meek, a retired industrial researcher, and William O'Neill, a self-proclaimed medium, the group claimed to have developed a device capable of establishing two-way real-time communication with the dead. Spiricom was a strange fusion of analog technology and psychic intuition. O'Neill reported receiving technical blueprints during dreams and meditations, allegedly from the spirit of a deceased NASA engineer. Using those instructions, the team built a machine composed of radio oscillators, white noise generators, and frequency modulators. What followed became one of the most controversial events in paranormal research. O'Neill produced a series of audio recordings in which he appeared to be conversing with a disembodied voice calling itself Dr. Muller, a deceased scientist who spoke in fluent English with a distinct German accent. The recordings were eerie. too mechanical to be natural, but too coherent to be dismissed as coincidence. Mueller would respond directly to O'Neill's questions, offering detailed technical advice, philosophical musings, and cryptic warnings about humanity's future. Spiricom became a legend in paranormal circles, though mainstream science dismissed it as fraud or delusion. Yet the tapes remain, and to this day, no one has been able to replicate the technology or conclusively debunk the recordings. Parallel to this, more conventional research was being conducted by institutions like the Psychical Research Foundation in North Carolina and the Society for Psychical Research in the UK. They focused on replicability, placing recorders in sealed rooms, eliminating external radio interference, and conducting double-blind analysis of the results. In one study, researchers at a lab in Edinburgh reported capturing consistent EVPs when recording in an underground bunker known for historical deaths. The control recordings, done in identical rooms with no known deaths, yielded nothing. The difference was small, but statistically significant. The military also took notice. Declassified documents from the early 1990s reveal that segments of the U.S. intelligence community, particularly those involved in remote viewing and psychic spying programs, briefly explored EVP as a potential form of non-conventional communication. Files from Project Stargate hint at unexplained audio phenomena recorded during sensory isolation exercises. Though little came of these inquiries publicly, their mere existence added weight to the idea that EVP might tap into something real, even if its source remained elusive. In the private sector, one of the most methodical efforts came from a man named Marcello Bacci, a retired radio technician in Grosseto, Italy. For over 2 decades, Bacci hosted weekly sessions in which grieving families would gather in a small room, where he used modified vacuum tube radios to allow voices to come through. Witnesses described hearing the names of their loved ones spoken clearly, often with their unique vocal characteristics. No payment was accepted. Bacci refused to commercialize the work. Audio experts and skeptical investigators examined his setup repeatedly, but failed to find any evidence of fraud or trickery. Then came the advent of digital recorders in the late 1990s and early 2000s, which introduced a new era of EVP. Unlike analog tape, which introduced background hiss and mechanical noise, digital recording offered near-silent environments. Strangely, many researchers reported that digital EVPs were clearer, sometimes louder, but also more aggressive. Voices that once whispered now barked commands. One notorious case involved a Pennsylvania paranormal team who captured a voice yelling "Get out" during a session in a closed psychiatric ward. Moments later, a member of the team collapsed from what was later diagnosed as a sudden panic-induced arrhythmia. Despite countless hoaxes and misinterpretations over the years, there remained a consistent thread in the most credible EVP evidence. The voices responded, interacted, and in many cases, knew things they should not have known. And as the investigations deepened, so too did the unease. Because if the dead were truly speaking, who else might be listening? The search for explanations behind electronic voice phenomena has divided researchers into 2 primary camps: those who believe the voices are spiritual or paranormal in origin, and those who argue for psychological or scientific interpretations. Within each camp, theories range from the compelling to the bizarre, each offering a different lens through which to view the mystery. The mystery. Among believers in the paranormal, the dominant theory is straightforward. EVP represents direct communication with the dead. According to this view, the voices are conscious entities, spirits, ghosts, or remnants of human consciousness, that use ambient sound waves or electromagnetic fields to imprint messages into recording devices. The process isn't fully understood, but some theorists suggest that these spirits manipulate the energy of white noise, or even the mind of the investigator, to form coherent speech. This view is bolstered by the way many EVPs seem to respond to direct questions, echo the voices of deceased loved ones, or even reference personal events known only to the recorder. Others in the paranormal field propose a variation of this idea, that EVP is not a product of the dead, but of parallel realities or interdimensional bleed-through. In this theory, what we hear on the tapes might be fragments of lives occurring in a different vibrational plane, overlapping with our own for brief, chaotic moments. According to proponents, the boundaries between these realities are thinner in emotionally charged environments. Haunted locations, sites of death or trauma, or near individuals in extreme psychological states. The voices, then, are not messages meant for us, but accidental intrusions into our world from elsewhere. A more ominous subset of theorists believe the voices are not human at all, but something far older and darker. Some spiritualists, particularly within religious traditions, warn that many EVPs are actually demonic or malevolent entities masquerading as human souls. These entities, they argue, may initially offer comforting messages to lure listeners deeper into communication, only to later reveal hostile or disturbing intentions. This view is often cited in cases where the voices grow increasingly aggressive, profane, or threatening over time. In certain instances, repeated sessions have coincided with worsening mental health, severe nightmares, or reports of physical disturbances in the home. To some, this suggests that EVP sessions might open portals, not just to the dead, but to something far more dangerous. On the skeptical side, the most widely accepted explanation is auditory pareidolia, the brain's tendency to find familiar patterns in random noise. Just as we might see shapes in clouds or faces in wood grain, we can also interpret meaningless static as recognizable speech, especially when prompted to expect it. The mind fills in the blanks, often unconsciously. In this view, what sounds like "don't go in there" may actually be a random collision of static and background hum. The expectation of hearing something meaningful leads to the perception of a voice that was never there. Another theory hinges on radio frequency interference. Analog recording devices, especially older tape recorders and radios, are vulnerable to picking up stray transmissions, snippets from CB radios, police scanners, or distant radio stations bouncing across the ionosphere. Under this theory, many EVPs are simply the result of accidental broadcast fragments captured out of context. However, this doesn't account for digital recordings or sessions conducted in Faraday cages, which block electromagnetic signals and still result in anomalous voices. Some researchers have even explored quantum mechanics for answers. One fringe theory proposes that human consciousness is not confined to the body but exists in a quantum field, allowing for residual imprints to linger after death. EVP might then be a byproduct of this field, echoes of thought, emotion, or memory still vibrating within the fabric of space-time. These aren't conversations with the dead, but recordings of consciousness reverberating like distant thunder. Each theory, whether grounded in belief or science, seems to illuminate part of the truth without fully explaining it. The phenomenon remains maddeningly elusive. For every EVP that can be rationalized, there's another that resists classification. Too clear, too specific, too timely. These voices challenge the boundary between science and faith, forcing us to consider that the world may be stranger and more layered than we're willing to admit. In recent years, the surge in affordable technology and widespread internet access has fueled a renaissance in EVP experimentation. Digital audio recorders, smartphone apps, and even custom-built spirit boxes have become common tools among amateur ghost hunters and enthusiasts. What once required reel-to-reel tape and bulky equipment can now be accomplished with a phone and a quiet room. And with this accessibility has come a flood of new recordings. Some credible, many questionable, and a few truly disturbing. One of the most widely circulated modern cases emerged from a YouTube channel called Silent Hours, run by a former audio engineer who began experimenting with EVP after the death of his sister in 2018. Initially, his channel focused on the technical aspects of recording, demonstrating noise filters, frequency adjustments, and waveform analysis. But then the content took a darker turn. In a video posted in early 2020, he claimed to have captured a clear voice responding to a whispered question. When he asked, "Are you here?" a faint but unmistakable reply followed, "Always." Skeptics flooded the comments, accusing him of manipulation. In response, he uploaded raw, unedited files along with his session logs, inviting others to analyze them. A few digital forensic specialists took him up on the offer. The verdict? No signs of post-production tampering. The voice was embedded in the waveform itself, and it didn't match any known speech pattern filters or sample banks. What made it more unsettling was that the voice repeated his sister's nickname, something he hadn't spoken aloud during the session. That video drew millions of views and inspired thousands of others to try their own experiments. Soon, social media platforms like TikTok and Reddit were flooded with bite-sized clips of supposed EVP captures, while many were obvious hoaxes, overlaid audio, staged reactions, or misinterpretations of background sounds. Some stood out for their clarity and emotional weight. One video showed a young woman conducting a session in her deceased grandmother's kitchen. When she asked, "Do you remember me?" a crackling voice responded, "My little star." The woman collapsed in tears. She later explained that the phrase was something only her grandmother used, never spoken to anyone else. Modern ghost hunting apps have also played a controversial role in EVP's resurgence. Some use preloaded sound banks, allowing words to be randomly triggered based on electromagnetic readings. Critics argue this undermines any credibility, as the results are essentially manufactured. But others claim these apps, while flawed, sometimes produce responses far too accurate to be chance. One app-based session in a New Jersey cemetery produced a sequence of words that, when transcribed, matched the name and date on a nearby tombstone. The recorder swore he hadn't seen it until after the session. Beyond social media, a quiet but determined group of researchers has continued studying EVP, using more rigorous methods. At the Institute for Transcommunication Studies in Berlin, scientists have begun correlating EVP events with geomagnetic fluctuations, solar activity, and even lunar phases. Preliminary findings suggest a slight increase in EVP clarity during times of heightened electromagnetic disturbance, supporting theories that energy plays a role in whatever process is occurring. But not all recent developments have been scientific. Some are simply inexplicable. In 2022, a team in Oregon reported receiving a series of EVP messages in Morse code. After translating the sequences, they were stunned to find complete sentences, one of which read, "We never left." Another read, "This is not your world." The team verified that no Morse devices or radios were active during the sessions, and their equipment had been independently inspected. These developments have stirred both excitement and caution. As interest in EVP grows, so does the possibility that something truly unknown is being touched. Whether these voices come from the dead, another dimension, or are echoes of our own minds, the line between experiment and invocation becomes increasingly blurred, and with each new recording, that boundary gets thinner. As the phenomenon of electronic voice phenomena permeated public consciousness, it began to reshape not only individual lives, but also the collective psyche of entire communities. What was once a niche interest has become a cultural undercurrent, an eerie presence woven into the fabric of modern folklore, entertainment, and personal belief systems. For those who've experienced it firsthand, EVP leaves a permanent mark, challenging assumptions about death, reality, and the limits of perception. Psychologists studying the effects of paranormal experiences have noted recurring emotional patterns among individuals who engage in EVP sessions. Many report feelings of connection and healing, particularly those grieving the loss of a loved one. Hearing a familiar voice, even just a whisper, can offer closure where words were left unsaid. But for others, the experience becomes a psychological trap. There are cases of people becoming obsessed, conducting daily sessions, isolating themselves, and spiraling into paranoia or depression. For them, the voices never stop. Some claim they follow them, even without a recorder running. A support group based in Northern California, formed in 2019, calls itself the Whisper Line. Its members, numbering just under 50, meet bi-weekly to share their EVP experiences and discuss the emotional toll they've endured. Many are former skeptics, engineers, teachers, and professionals who stumbled into the phenomenon after personal tragedy. One member, a retired nurse named Carol, described hearing her deceased husband's voice every night for 3 months. What began as comfort slowly turned to dread as the voice grew demanding, asking her to do things, isolate from friends, even threaten strangers. Carol eventually suffered a breakdown and was hospitalized for 6 weeks. She no longer records, but claims she still hears him faintly in moments of silence. These stories, while often dismissed as psychological distress, are not isolated. Online forums dedicated to EVP and spirit communication are filled with posts about escalating activity, voices that become hostile, and the overwhelming fear that comes with losing control over one's mind. Experts warn that in some cases, people experiencing psychosis or schizophrenia may interpret their symptoms through the lens of EVP, further complicating diagnosis and treatment. Yet in other instances, the recordings themselves contain undeniable, inexplicable evidence, suggesting that something real may coexist with the psychological response. Pop culture has seized on this tension between the real and the imagined. Films like White Noise, documentaries on streaming platforms, and hundreds of YouTube channels have made EVP both mainstream and terrifying. It is no longer unusual to see ghost hunters using digital recorders in haunted locations, their discoveries edited into suspenseful episodes complete with spectrogram visualizations and slow-motion audio analysis. EVP has become a fixture of modern horror, something viewers now expect as part of the ghost hunting toolkit. But its cultural impact goes deeper. The idea that the dead can still speak has altered how some people view grief, spirituality, and even time itself. In Japan, a growing number of individuals practice a form of modern spirit communication called tsunagari, in which voice recorders are used at shrines or ancestral altars in hopes of receiving a message. In the UK, some churches have quietly discouraged EVP experimentation near graveyards, citing disturbing feedback from parishioners who claim to have heard unnatural voices during prayer. The proliferation of the phenomenon has even led to calls for ethical guidelines. Some paranormal researchers now warn against indiscriminate EVP sessions, especially in emotionally charged or sacred places. They argue that without understanding what we're contacting, we may be invoking forces we're unprepared to deal with, whether those are spiritual, psychological, or something else entirely. The voices may answer, but their origin remains unknown, and the emotional consequences can be lasting. For every person comforted by a whispered "I love you" from beyond the grave, there is another haunted by the sound of their own name spoken from the dark. The cultural and psychological impact of EVP lies not just in the recordings themselves, but in what they awaken in those who choose to listen. Threaded through the vast archive of EVP accounts are certain elements that refuse to conform to chance or coincidence. These moments, documented, recorded, verified, linger like static between radio stations, nagging at the edge of rational understanding. Together, they form a pattern too unsettling to ignore and too fractured to explain away. It is in these details that the true mystery of EVP reveals itself, not in the broad strokes, but in the whispers that align too precisely to be dismissed. There is the case of the Holloway House in eastern Massachusetts, where a group of university students conducted an overnight investigation in 2016. The house, long abandoned and associated with a tragic 19th century fire, had no power or active communication lines. Using a simple digital recorder and a white noise generator, the students took turns asking questions in the dark. When the recording was played back, a clear voice responded to a question about the fire. It said, "We were asleep." Cross-referencing historical records later revealed that the fire began in the early morning hours, killing a family of 5, most believed to have died in their beds. The students had no prior knowledge of the event's exact timeline. Or the 2019 case in Oslo, Norway, where a man recovering from a traumatic brain injury claimed to hear voices in his dreams. Believing them to be hallucinations, his therapist suggested recording his sleep sessions. What they captured stunned both the patient and clinicians. Over several nights, the audio contained murmurs, indecipherable at first, then growing clearer. One phrase, repeated over 3 recordings, translated from Norwegian to English as, "We are the memory of the body." The man reported no prior exposure to that phrasing. Linguistic experts could not identify the dialect. Another unsettling moment came from a church basement in Louisiana, where a paranormal team investigating claims of poltergeist activity set up audio gear overnight. No team member stayed behind. When they returned the next morning, one recorder had stopped at precisely 3:33 a.m., and the final 30 seconds before it cut off captured the unmistakable sound of footsteps, followed by a child's voice whispering, "Don't look behind you." Surveillance footage showed the basement door never opened. The recorder had not moved. Then there's the often repeated experience of voices responding to the unspoken. Many researchers have reported conducting sessions where questions were thought but never vocalized, yet the playback captured direct answers. In 2020, a team in Colorado recorded a session where a participant silently wondered about his deceased brother's birthday. The voice that emerged was raspy, barely audible, but undeniably correct. July 5th. No one present had spoken the date aloud. The data file's metadata confirmed no external sounds were recorded until the playback revealed the voice. The sheer specificity of these moments, details tied to history, to memory, to deeply personal truths, suggests an intelligence behind the phenomenon, something aware, something listening. Even more chilling are the instances when the voices predict events. In rare cases, EVP sessions have yielded messages that seem to warn of future danger. A 2017 recording from a haunted railway tunnel in Pennsylvania included the words, "Turn back before the wire breaks." 3 days later, a local news outlet reported a partial collapse in the tunnel's support structure, caused by a corroded tension wire. The recording had been timestamped and archived days before the incident. No team member could explain it. These are not coincidences, not random fluctuations of static or the brain imposing order where there is none. Each detail, each voice that knows too much, pushes EVP further away from folklore and closer to something far more difficult to face. They suggest a presence that doesn't just echo, but perceives. A presence that doesn't just repeat, but replies. And as the recordings accumulate, so too does the chilling realization. The veil may be thinner than we think, and something on the other side is paying attention. If the veil truly is as thin as it seems, then the possibilities opened by electronic voice phenomena are as unsettling as they are profound. What if the voices captured on tape are not just echoes of the past, but active, observing intelligences? What if we're not simply listening to memories or impressions, but interacting with entities that exist outside our known dimensions of time and space? Entities capable of thought, perception, even intent. One of the most unnerving speculative theories proposes that EVP may be a form of surveillance, not by spirits, but by something altogether different. In this view, the voices are not remnants of human consciousness, but transmissions from an unknown intelligence observing our world from a higher dimensional perspective. This theory gained traction after a controversial 2021 recording from a remote station in Western Canada. A researcher attempting to capture ambient wildlife noise inadvertently recorded a series of mechanical tones, followed by a synthesized voice stating, "Observation window closed." The device had no wireless capabilities. Audio experts were unable to isolate any frequency artifacts to suggest radio interference. The message was clear, metallic, and utterly alien. Others propose a far more disturbing possibility, that EVP is not a communication across the boundary between life and death, but a malfunction, evidence of a simulated reality breaking down. If we entertain the hypothesis that our universe is a kind of programmed construct, then EVP could represent corrupted code or background processes briefly made audible. The disembodied voices, the glitch-like repetitions, the erratic clarity, they all mirror characteristics found in corrupted audio data or faulty digital systems. One recording captured during a 2022 EVP session in Romania contained a repetitive burst of sound that, when visualized in a spectrogram, formed a distinct binary pattern. When decoded, it read, "System fault." This theory dovetails with reports from researchers who claim their equipment has behaved unpredictably during EVP experiments. Devices power down without cause, fresh batteries drain in seconds, or recorders shut off moments before a message would have been captured. In some cases, the recordings are distorted with harmonic patterns that don't exist in natural human speech. A team in New Zealand discovered a 34-second clip where the voice changed pitch at mathematically perfect intervals. Too precise to be accidental, too unnatural to be human. But even within more traditional frameworks, speculative questions persist. If these are the dead, then where exactly are they? Are they trapped in a liminal state, caught between worlds, endlessly trying to reach us through fragments of energy? Are they aware of time? Do they perceive us as intruders or as their only lifeline to meaning? What happens if we stop listening? Or worse, what if we're being trained to listen for a reason we don't yet understand? Another chilling scenario proposes that not all voices are external. Some theorists believe EVP is a mirror, not a transmission from another realm, but a reflection of the subconscious. Under this hypothesis, we're not hearing ghosts or spirits, but fragmented thoughts and fears projected outward and captured by sensitive equipment. The mind, under stress or grief, may influence electromagnetic fields in subtle ways, imprinting words or emotional resonance onto nearby devices. If true, then EVP is not communication. It's confession. Not a window into another world, but a raw, unfiltered echo of our own inner darkness. Of course, none of these theories can be proven. That's what makes them dangerous. Once you begin to hear the voices, not metaphorically, but literally, your perception of the world shifts. Silence becomes suspect. Static no longer feels random. Every whisper in white noise carries weight. And the most terrifying possibility isn't that we're talking to the dead or that another intelligence is speaking through our machines. It's that we've already opened a channel, and we don't know how to close it. If there is one enduring truth that electronic voice phenomena forces us to confront, it's that the boundary between the living and the dead, between the known and the unknowable, is far more fragile than we dare to believe. Each crackle of static, each breathless whisper buried in silence, offers a glimpse into something beyond comprehension. Whether they are messages from the departed, echoes of consciousness, or signals from something entirely alien, the voices speak. And what they say is not always what we expect or want to hear. In homes across the world, people sit in quiet rooms with recorders rolling, asking questions into empty air. Some seek comfort, others seek proof. But what they often find is something far stranger. Answers that don't quite match the question. Voices that seem to know more than they should. Warnings that arrive before danger. Names spoken that were never uttered aloud. These are not merely stories. They are patterns, repetitions, signals in the noise. It's easy to dismiss a single EVP as coincidence, a trick of the ear, a digital anomaly. But when these messages begin to form intent, when they demonstrate memory, awareness, even personality, they become something else, something that no longer fits neatly into the categories of science or superstition, something that demands we rethink what it means to be alive, what it means to be conscious, and what, if anything, awaits beyond the veil. Even the most skeptical researchers, faced with the clarity of some recordings, have been forced to admit discomfort. When a voice answers a question before it's asked, or repeats a childhood nickname never spoken aloud, the lines begin to blur. The rational mind falters. And in that moment of doubt, the mystery deepens. Perhaps the most unsettling realization is not that the voices exist, but that they may have always been there, waiting, listening, speaking in frequencies we only recently learned to hear. We often think of technology as a human invention, a means to extend our reach and amplify our senses. But what if some of our devices were never just tools? What if they're keys, accidental or not, that unlock something ancient, something watching from the other side of silence? And if that door has been opened, what comes through may not be what we were hoping to find. It may speak like a friend. It may mimic the voices of those we've loved. It may even offer comfort. But once the connection is made, there is no way to guarantee who or what is on the other end. The recordings continue. New voices are captured every day. Some are soft and pleading. Others are angry. Some say they're trapped. Others claim they never died. A few simply repeat the same word over and over. Listen. Thanks for listening. This has been Paranormal Files. If you enjoyed today's episode, be sure to follow us wherever you get your podcasts. And if you'd like to support the show, subscribe to the Forbidden Knowledge Network on Patreon. Subscribe now.